walk me through what tests you gave to her and what they mean and how they function.
I administered a series of psychological tests that basically breaks down into two categories. Category 1 is an assessment of whether or not the defendant is faking mental illness. Very important to consider in a legal context. The second category was a broader assessment of her psychological functioning, and based on the symptoms that she was reporting within that general assessment of psychological functioning, I also administered tests that specifically examined for symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD for short.
Okay, so in other words, you didn't come right in and just give a PTSD test right away?
No.
Okay. That was only after you did the general psychological functioning testing?
Correct, and hours of clinical interviewing as well.
Okay. Talk to me about the first part. You said you did testing for what you called faking of symptoms, or malingering is the medical term, right?
Yes.
Okay. How is it that you test to see if somebody is faking it or giving you correct answers or somehow, tricking you or trying to?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I do is simply administer a clinical interview. So I am just talking with the defendant, trying to learn more about her. And in that, I ask a lot of open-ended questions. So I'm not asking a ton of questions that are yes, no, but more questions that are asking things like, tell me about how you've been feeling. Tell me about your sleep. So I'm not asking really specific things. I'm just eliciting whatever Ms. Mericle had to tell me. And based on that, I can tell whether someone is reciting a textbook almost, like they've read somewhere what the symptoms of an illness are and they're just repeating them back to me, versus someone who is telling me, hey, these things are really going on with me. Here's examples of how these symptoms show up in my life. So if I'm asking about sleep, they might say, and Ms. Mericle said this actually, like, on one hand, I really want to fall asleep. I really try to fall asleep, but then I'm right back up, and then there's no way I'm going back to sleep. And that isn't something you could pull out of a textbook. So already I'm getting a sense that she's responding honestly. But of course, we want to back that up with some scientific tests. So in this case, I administered two. One was a test that specifically assessed malingering. And when we're looking at malingering, we're looking at a couple of things. When someone is faking mental illness, they will report every single symptom of mental illness that there is. So if I'm asking about all the symptoms of anxiety, for example, do you worry? Yes. Are you having trouble sleeping? Yes. Same with depression. I would say, do you feel sad? Yes. Do you have concentration problems? Yes. And it was all yeses. So that would be somebody who's faking it. The other thing that we look at is the distinction between what someone is reporting and what I can observe. So, or what I've read in medical records. So if someone is saying, I'm nervous and jumpy all the time, but they can sit through 9 hours of interview and just be as calm can be, then there's a difference between what someone is telling me and what they're showing me. And I think that's a really important piece too. The other thing that folks who are faking it will do is report symptoms that they think are mental health symptoms but aren't really mental health symptoms. So the most common one is the experience of someone telling me that they see little green men. That's not a symptom of mental illness. That's not something that actually happens, but somewhere along the way it got into the believers of malingering that is something that you should say. So these tests really look at those things, the difference between reported and observed, whether somebody is just saying, yes, I have every single symptom, or I have every single symptom and it's really bad. And in this case, Ms. Mericle was not malingering. So on two separate tests, she showed a pattern of responding honestly.
Are the tests that you give, these psychological tests, do they have any tests built into them, fail-safes to catch people if people are trying to fake it, if they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes?
Judge, I apologize. May we approach briefly?
Come on up. Again, thank you, lawyers, doing their job. Go ahead.
I think we were talking about the general psychological functioning testing that you conducted.
Yes.
And I asked you what fail-safes are built into that psychological testing.
So I believe the test you're referring to is called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI. This is a really old psychological test that's been revised a number of times to keep up with modern populations. It's a 335-item true-false test. The wonderful thing about this test, and the reason why it is the most frequently used in the scientific community, is because it has safeguards built into it. So we can know from this test whether or not someone is putting in a reasonable amount of effort, whether or not someone is responding randomly, whether or not someone is exaggerating their mental health symptoms, or whether someone is actually underreporting mental health symptoms. So we have all this extra information that we get about someone in addition to their mental health symptoms.
What were the results of this general psychological functioning that led you to go into step 3, which you've testified about as the specific PTSD testing?
Yes. So based on this test, Ms. Mericle endorsed clinically significant numbers of both health complaints, things like concentration issues, memory problems, pain, things like that, and clinically significant numbers of symptoms that are most frequently associated with PTSD.
And after you got those results back that had those markers, for lack of a term,
Yes.
Did you make a decision then to go on to further testing?
Yes, I thought that based on the results of this initial test, which is true-false, that I wanted more information about symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress.
Was there any other, we've talked about your interviews with Ms. Mericle, your face-to-faces.
Yes.
Were you pulling from any other documentary evidence to help you steer in that direction?
Besides my interviews and the MMPI, before I administered any other kind of testing?
Maybe you did that after, so tell me, I'm not sure.
So I had reviewed all of what's called the collateral data, so the body camera footage and the police reports and investigative interviews. I had reviewed all of that prior to meeting with Ms. Mericle, and then I interviewed her, and then the next step is to administer tests, the more general ones, the assessments of effort and of honesty, and then going into a more thorough assessment where I'm asking about PTSD.
Tell me and tell us what the PTSD testing, what it's called and what it consists of and what the results were.
Absolutely. And it's probably helpful before I do that just to give you a little explanation of what PTSD is. That's a term that gets thrown around a lot in the self-help literature or on Instagram. And so I thought I'd just go back a little bit and maybe educate everyone about what PTSD is in the clinical sense.
Thank you.
So in order to be diagnosed with PTSD, someone has to have experienced a trauma as defined by the psychiatric and psychological community. And the way that's defined is someone who has directly experienced a life-threatening event or a direct threat to their safety. The other way that someone might experience PTSD is if they've witnessed something like that. So they've witnessed someone else's life being in danger or a threat to that person's safety. But the point is that it has to be life-threatening or safety-threatening. It can't be, my boss yelled at me at work. Yes.
Let me make sure I got this right.
Sure.
In order for a person to be diagnosed, meaning by the psychological community,
yes,
this person has PTSD, they have to have directly experienced a life-threatening event, or potentially they saw someone else have that.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
How is it that there's a way to tell that they meet the definition, basically?
So after so it kind of goes stepwise. So in order to diagnose PTSD, there has to be a trauma. And then from there, the symptoms fall into 4 categories. So what happens when someone experiences PTSD or when someone has a trauma, our fight or flight response kicks in. And the fight or flight response is what happens in every single animal, humans included, when we get scared or when we perceive a threat. What happens is our fight or flight mechanism goes on, and that is both a psychological response, so there's an emotional response, and there's a physical response. And it prepares us to respond to the threat, either by getting the heck out of there or by fighting back, and in some instances, by freezing. And what happens with PTSD...
Say those again. You said one of them was freezing.
Correct.
Meaning they don't move at all.
Correct.
And then one of them is fighting.
Yes.
And then the other one's flight.
Yes.
Meaning run.
Yes.
Okay.
Escape. Absolutely. So what happens when someone has post-traumatic stress disorder is that fight or flight switch stays on. And so the trauma does not recede into this person's memory, but rather the person who experiences trauma, it's like it's happening in real time over and over again. So what happens when someone's experiencing PTSD, they will have what's called re-experiencing symptoms, where they are reliving the trauma either through dreams or through memories that just kind of come into their head when they don't want them there, or through what's called flashbacks, where they actually believe that they are back in the situation. Or there will be some trigger, whether that's a smell or a sound or the sight of a particular person where they have that fight or flight response all over again. The second category of symptoms is avoidance. So when we feel bad, the thing we want to do is get away from it. We don't want to think about bad memories. We don't want to have them around. We don't want to talk about them. And so folks with PTSD will go to great lengths to avoid thinking about, talking about, feeling anything related to the traumatic experience. Sometimes these people...
It seems like,
yes.
What if the person is in a relationship with someone and the thing that's negative happened within that relationship? Is that something they're going to even avoid talking about in that relationship?
Yes.
That's part of the problem, basically.
Yes.
You said the switch stays on when
Yes.
when you have this exposure to the life-threatening event.
That's correct.
And how does that play into a person's ability to sleep?
So that category of symptoms is called hyperarousal. So because this fight or flight switch is constantly on, someone thinks they're in danger 24/7. And of course, when we think we're in danger 24/7, you don't sleep well. You're kind of agitated and on edge all the time. You might startle to loud noises, so you're just kind of jumpy. Some folks can be what's called hypervigilant, where they're constantly looking over their shoulder or checking for the exits. I often had veterans who would say when they sat down in a restaurant, they had to know where all the exits were before they could be comfortable. Those are what's called hyperarousal symptoms.
Would we see, let's say, examples of that person sending, late night texts past midnight, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., stuff like that?
Yes, it would be this chronic pattern of sleeplessness and just an agitated, constant agitation.
Okay. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. You said re-experiencing, avoidance, hypervigilance.
And then the fourth category is that PTSD essentially changes how we think and how we feel. So when someone's been through trauma, they start to think that the world is a much more dangerous place, that people are dangerous, people are not to be trusted, that they, again, don't want to talk to anybody. They often blame themselves. Trauma is so nonsensical, and there often isn't a why. And so survivors of trauma will often blame themselves for any of the things that happen to them because that's the only conclusion they can come up with. And of course, if someone is blaming themselves all the time, they feel pretty depressed.
If they're blaming themselves, if they're in this aspect of the I guess, the disease, the mental disease they're living with, is that going to also be something you might see in some of their communications, taking blame for things that may not be their fault?
Yes.
You've got re-experiencing, there's avoidance, there's hypervigilance, and you titled the last one, and I didn't get it, I'm sorry.
Negative changes in how we think and feel.
Okay. Would someone experiencing negative changes in how they think and feel, would that be something that people on the outside of them might notice, like friends, family, things like that?
Yes, they would notice things like maybe social withdrawal, that they're just not talking as much anymore, they're not socializing as much anymore, just seem more down.
Would they necessarily hear from that person about what the trauma was? Meaning, would they be told, what's actually going on?
No, because back to the avoidance piece, people who have experienced trauma do not want to talk about it.
Did you have experience at the Veterans Administration and in your work at Georgia Regional and in your education with intimate partner violence?
Yes.
How much, give me an idea of how many persons you've seen that have experienced intimate partner violence and treated and evaluated?
So if we say that, let's say, I would say maybe 35% of the evaluations I conducted at the VA were women who had been in the military. The incidence of intimate partner violence among female veterans is upwards of 85%. So I say that almost every woman who I interviewed in the context of the VA had experienced some sort of intimate partner violence.
Did sometimes those intimate partner violence matters also sort of coincide with a PTSD diagnosis or a PTSD case? Are they always there or not?
Meaning that somebody who has experienced intimate partner violence, do they necessarily get a diagnosis of PTSD?
Exactly.
No.
And tell me why they wouldn't automatically be PTSD. They've experienced some sort of trauma, perhaps.
That's correct.
Would they not present to you, meaning they wouldn't test out as having PTSD?
Well, the most simple answer is that our brains are incredibly tough and our brains are incredibly resilient. So that most people who have experienced trauma over time, even with no treatment at all, will not go on to develop symptoms of PTSD. That the incidence of PTSD among combat veterans, for example, is about 10%.
So we don't know, in other words, why some people end up with it and some people don't, even though they've been exposed to the same sorts of...
That's a really long answer and a really complicated one, and I don't want to bore the jury.
Sorry.
But there are some individual factors that play into it, historical factors, just kind of general psychological makeup. The research is very much active as to figuring out who's more vulnerable to PTSD than others.
I meant to ask you this earlier. Have you testified for both have you testified as an expert for the state?
Yes.
What percentage of the time that you've been called to court to testify as a forensic psychological expert, what percentage of the time have you been testifying for the government?
75% of the time.
Have you had cases where you've been testifying for the government against a defendant who's claiming that they have PTSD and you found that they didn't?
That's correct, yes.
And help us understand how you can discern this person doesn't have it and that Ms. Mericle does.
Sure. So in that was another case of intimate partner violence. The defendant was actually a man. In that particular case that I'm talking about, the only symptom that he ever came up with was, I have flashbacks. couldn't describe flashbacks, couldn't tell me what happens, didn't spontaneously report any other symptoms of anxiety. I met with him on several occasions, and he too was calm, collected, but insisted that these flashbacks amounted to PTSD. It just wasn't the case.
In Ms. Miracle's case, did you, in your evaluations of her and testing of her, did you find anything to suggest that she was in any way faking to you that she has PTSD?
No.
And let's go ahead and finish up with the PTSD testing that you gave her in your results, okay?
Sure. So to follow up on all of the just kind of general interviewing that I did with Ms. Mericle, I also administered what's called a structured clinical interview. So that's essentially a script where I'm bound to ask very specific questions about PTSD symptoms, and then Ms. Mericle's responses are scored. This is a test that's put out by the National Center for PTSD. I had to get a lot of training on it to make sure that I was asking the questions correctly and scoring the responses correctly. So this test is called the CAPS, and it takes about an hour to administer, and we basically go one by one through all the different symptoms of PTSD, and I ask for a lot of detail. I would always save this kind of test for later on in my evaluation of a client because we're bringing up so much sensitive material that folks usually don't want to talk about.
And what were the results from Ms. Miracle's PTSD testing as well as her other tests that you conducted?
So her entire presentation was consistent with a clinical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Once you have gotten the results back from all the testing and you have concluded that she presents as PTSD, what does that tell us as far as the source or the potential source of the PTSD symptoms that she has?
So as part of the CAPS that I administer, the first thing that we do is go through a series of traumatic events. So just a general questionnaire. Has this happened to you? Has this happened to you? And you have the option to say, yes, this happened to me, or I witnessed it. After going through that questionnaire, I will ask the respondent, I will ask them, okay, now tell me, of all these things, what is the worst trauma you've ever experienced? And that's called an index trauma, or the most horrible memory that they have.
And in this case, the index trauma that was reported to you was what?
Was Mr. Barron pointing a gun in Miss Miracle's face and telling her that she better not close her eyes tonight.
And that was reported to you as having occurred on the March 7th, March 8th event?
That's correct.
Is the index trauma when we call it index trauma, we're saying this is our likely source of PTSD, or this is just the most powerful reported source?
Both. I mean, it's the most likely source of her symptoms.
Did she report to you that she had any post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that arose prior to March the 7th?
She did.
And what were those symptoms?
The symptoms that she was reporting prior to that night really had to do with a heightened state of anxiety, feeling nervous all the time, having some nightmares, and generally not sleeping well.
Did she recount to you the nature of the nightmares? What was, I guess the topic of the nightmares that she was having?
So the nightmares that she was having at the time I interviewed her, the nightmares involved the index trauma itself. So she was having nightmares in which Mr. Barron was coming after her with the gun.
Did you review any collateral information where Miss Mericle was reporting these symptoms prior to you ever having gone to see her? Specifically related to the other counseling sessions that she'd had?
Yes, so she had reported in to her jail counselors. Both reported and jail staff observed mental health symptoms.
When someone is, I guess, faking mental health symptoms, is there generally something that they're wanting from that?
Yes.
Okay, what is that?
So the technical term is secondary gain. So in a criminal setting, that might be that if the person is incarcerated, they might want to fake mental health symptoms to move to different housing that they perceive as better. They might be doing it for the purpose of a lesser sentence or an acquittal. In the civil setting, someone might be faking mental illness for the purpose of money or not working or both.
Did you see any indication in the materials involving Ms. Mericle that she was using these reported symptoms that happened before you ever got involved to try to do something with respect to medical?
No, to the contrary, she was showing so much distress at the jail that jail staff offered to move her to medical housing, and she declined the housing. She didn't want to go.
Is that consistent or inconsistent with malingering or faking?
So it's inconsistent with faking. It's consistent with honest mental health symptoms.
Did you review the body cameras of the initial responding officers?
Yes.
And is there anything on those body cameras specifically with respect to treatment from EMS or anything else that is consistent or inconsistent with malingering?
Yes, so on the night of the offense, on the body camera footage, EMS is concerned about Ms. Mericle having a panic attack. They're concerned about elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure. They offer repeatedly, really, for her to go to the hospital, hey, you should go get this checked out, and she declines repeatedly. And so that would be inconsistent with malingering, very consistent with honest reporting.
Did you notice anything else in the body cameras that would be suggestive of a consistent mental health issue outside of the home there on the body cameras?
Yes, so Ms. Mericle's behavior as observed on the body camera footage is incredibly consistent with what happens when somebody has just experienced a traumatic event. There was an inability to calm down. There was emotions going up and down, hyperventilating, throwing up at one point. All of these symptoms, again, if we're thinking about that fight or flight switch and it is on high alert and really hasn't come down yet, we are seeing the emotional and physical overload of that throughout the entire duration of the body camera footage.
Would her behavior on the body camera be consistent with an acute stress response to something very recently occurring?
Yes.
Did you notice anything? Well, let me ask you this. When you treat patients in your office who are people who have PTSD,
Yes.
is there some physical responses, some physical manifestations that those patients will actually express and that you see, and that's consistent with what you see from Ms. Mericle?
Yes. So the treatment for PTSD is pretty intense, and it involves revisiting the traumatic experience over and over and over. So in the therapeutic setting, my clients who are diagnosed with PTSD, I'm having them in this structured setting repeat the trauma in real time over and over and over again. The point is to move the memory of that trauma back in its rightful place so that it doesn't feel like we're re-experiencing it in real time. And that is a really, really challenging process. And the clients who come get treatment for PTSD are incredibly brave because it's just so difficult. Because especially in the initial retellings of the traumatic event, we see those physiologic symptoms, those physical symptoms happening all over again. I often keep a bucket close to the chair because I will often have clients throw up. I will often have clients have panic attacks, that we see these symptoms and we just have to work to regulate through them in therapy, but it's a pretty tough process.
Did you notice in the interview with the police where Ms. Mericle keeps saying that it's hot and unzipping her, I guess it's a fleece or whatever. Did you notice that in the interview?
Yes, I did.
Is that consistent or inconsistent with a trauma response?
That is consistent. That's part of the physical reaction, is that anxiety and the threat response makes us super hot. We start sweating profusely.
It seemed to be on the body camera, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but that it was almost like she would say something in a certain state of mind and then go into a different state of mind and then get elevated, then come back down. Did you notice that on the cameras?
I did.
Is that consistent or inconsistent with an acute trauma response?
That's consistent, because what is so challenging when someone has just very recently been through trauma is that we're not regulating our emotions real well, that our brain is on overload. This life-threatening thing just happened, and the brain is working double time to try and regulate, but it's not going that well. So we'll see periods of calm and then periods of hyperventilating, and that's perfectly consistent with a stress response.
I think you used a term for me before. The word was labile.
Yes.
Okay, what is that?
Emotional lability, or labile, means that emotions are up, down, all over the place. People who have really labile emotions basically go from 0 to 60 like that they're just very, very quick to get emotional and often just as quick to calm down. It's just up and down, up and down. It's exhausting for the person who's experiencing it.
Is that sort of up and down emotional swing, is that consistent or inconsistent with a acute stress response to trauma?
It's consistent.
Is someone who is, I guess, faking a trauma response, let's say, are they typically capable of keeping that going for a very long period of time?
No. Someone who is faking any kind of mental health condition, that's one of the ways that we know that they are faking a mental health condition, because they can't keep up the act. That they'll try it for a few minutes, but then will inadvertently slip back into being themselves.
And you've reviewed the 3 hours or so of the body camera. Are you even familiar with somebody ever being able to do that for such a long period of time if it's not actually happening?
No, I've never seen that.
Have you ever heard of, if someone doesn't close their eyes, that means they're faking a panic attack? Have you ever heard that before?
No.
Is that a medically correct conclusion?
Not at all. And in fact, quite the opposite. When someone's having a panic attack, they usually have their eyes wide open because it's a fear response.
I wanted to ask you about the elevated heart rate that the EMS folks found from Ms. Mericle when they were treating her outside of the, on the front porch there.
Yes.
Is that consistent or inconsistent with a trauma response?
Consistent.
And again, if she is faking it and trying to get out of the situation, and they've offered her, hey, let's go to the hospital, would she be more or less likely to accept that offer?
If she were faking mental health symptoms, she would want to go to the hospital.
Is her declining that treatment consistent or inconsistent with faking it?
Inconsistent with faking it.
Have you reviewed the 4,000 pages of text messages that we sent you?
I absolutely have.
Okay. And I mean the messages from Mr. Barron and Miss Mericle.
Yes.
Okay. Is it consistent or inconsistent with intimate partner violence for the victim in an intimate partner violence relationship to be jealous?
Yes.
It is inconsistent for the victim to be jealous?
It's consistent for the victim to be jealous.
it seems, and you're going to have to help me out with that, because it seems like if I'm frightened of someone because they're violent with me, that I wouldn't dare ever mention something like, hey, you cheated on me, or, how dare you do this with this woman, things like that. Help me understand that.
Absolutely. So the intimate partner violence is so complicated. Like any relationship is messy, but relationships that involve intimate partner violence are really messy because they involve the power dynamics where one partner is coercing, meaning that they're getting the partner to do a bunch of things she doesn't want to do, and controlling the person in various ways. Sometimes that's through physical threats, sometimes that's through financial, sometimes that's through emotional abuse, like calling someone a name. But the purpose is to establish a power differential and prevent that person from thinking she has any other options but to be in that relationship. So what we see in intimate partner violent relationships that include intimate partner violence, is that we will see the survivors of those relationships sometimes behave erratically. So sometimes make efforts to really hang on to this person, sometimes get angry to sort of test the waters, or sometimes to get attention. But we don't see a consistent pattern of behavior all the time. So someone who is in a relationship where there is abuse and then finds out that that person is cheating might actually confront that person because that's a socially acceptable thing to do. That is not a person who is in the relationship. That's something where the survivor might not blame herself. She might think that that's something that the perpetrator is doing all on their own.